Okay, I guess let's get started. Um, uh, good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you might be. My name is Justin Worland. I'm a senior correspondent at Time Magazine. I'm really thrilled to be hosting this session today. Thrilled that so many of you have joined us. I think really, sort of an interesting topic, and one that I've really, at this point, built my career around, which is this idea of covering climate beyond the science, but really thinking about the way in which climate touches everything. My title is senior correspondent, covering the intersection of climate change, politics, policy, and society, which is sort of a wordy way of saying that I think about the way that climate change and the way that we address climate change is going to touch, really everything in our society, and down to our daily lives. Beyond, I guess I should say, I came to the climate beat not as somebody with a climate science background. I had reported on health. I had reported on politics. I studied history in college and wrote about race and the civil rights movement in the U.S. And so I didn't come to this issue thinking about it as a scientific issue, but instead thinking about all of these sort of connected things that are related to climate. And that's been sort of my approach covering this issue over the last 6 years or so. Um, I also, beyond sort of my day job, I do events like this, love talking and engaging with other journalists and other people who are interested in this area. I'm on the steering committee of an organization called the Uproot Project, which works to elevate environmental journalists of color, and also to help change the narrative about how these issues are spoken about, including prioritizing a diverse set of voices. So I encourage anyone to check that out if you're interested. I hope that this session will be dynamic, and so I'd love to just have as much audience engagement as possible. So please feel free to write in the chat. I have a poll to start, and then later I'm going to call and ask and see if we can get some people, excuse me, if you're willing I guess, to sort of promote you to be essentially a panelist and talk and participate more actively as well. But possibly even earlier than the sort of set aside time later in the session, if anyone is interested. So please drop reflections, drop questions in the chat as we go. I really want to hear from as many people as possible. And it seems like there are not that many of you, so which is totally fine, and in some ways is kind of nice, because maybe we can have a more intimate discussion and get multiple of you into the sort of panelist space at one time, which would make for, I think, for me, a more interesting, dynamic discussion where we can exchange ideas and really talk through things. So yes, so keep that in mind. Before I get into the sort of presentation, I have this poll. So if you just look at the poll on the tab right next to the chat, I just would curious to hear a little bit about what this audience is. So just click whatever best describes you. And I see we've got a good number of votes already, but if you haven't voted, please do. I'm curious to see who's here. Okay. Well, in any case, for right now, it seems that we have a good mix of journalists who cover climate, one journalist who covers, a couple journalists who cover climate, and then some others who are interested, but not specifically on the beat right now. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. You can see that. Okay. Well, I've introduced myself, senior correspondent at Time. I'm going to start just by sharing this little anecdote, relevant and amusing in some ways. This is a man named Matt Russell. He's a farmer in Iowa. He farms, he raises beef, cattle for beef, as well as some other crops. He is very active on climate change. He leads an organization that tries to raise awareness in rural communities about climate change, and he's active getting farmers to buy into the idea that there's a role for them to play in addressing climate change by sequestering carbon in their soil. This is like what he does as like a key thing on the side of farming. During the 2020 presidential campaign, his farm became a stopping point for Democratic presidential candidates. They would come to his farm and hear about what he's doing on climate and engage him and learn about the ways in which with climate. And so we see here, I was there that day, didn't take this photo, but I was there that day when now Vice President, then Senator / candidate Kamala Harris visited his farm, and there they are chatting about climate. I actually took this photo just to give a sense of the crowd that was there. I mean, there were more than a dozen journalists. Not everybody there is necessarily a journalist, but more than a dozen journalists gathered to watch this little moment here in Iowa. I wasn't there this day, but Beto O'Rourke came to the farm with his wife, Amy. So that was another presidential contender who made a visit to the farm. And there's President Biden. This wasn't actually at the farm, but they engaged. He got his message across to President Biden, then candidate Biden, when he was campaigning in Iowa. Oh, well, before I get, I mentioned that we had journalists that day. I was there when Senator Harris was there. We have, journalists who attended all of these events, got to see this man who has dedicated himself to climate and farming and that intersection, and has gotten the attention of presidential candidates because of that. And the journalists, I was there, dozens of journalists were there to get that sort of front-hand seat to hear that message. And so what did they write coming out of that opportunity, that event? So I have two headlines here, and there are many others, but one is, can Kamala catch Joe and Elizabeth in Iowa? Very straightforward political horse race reporting. The person visited, saw this, and wrote a horse race story. Like, this is campaigning, just as campaigning traditionally happens. It's a horse race, and about who's ahead and who's behind. The other one I think is even more amusing. O'Rourke campaigns with wife, looks to boost female support. So this reporter wrote about the fact that that Beto O'Rourke's wife came with him to the campaign, sort of missing the whole point of this campaign stop, right? Which was to learn about climate, to bring attention to the changing dialogue around climate in the quote unquote American heartland among farmers, and it completely just was ignored. Either I don't want to say that it was for malicious reasons, but it was ignored by the reporters who attended. So why do I tell this story, right? I think it's a perfect introduction to really what is, in some ways, the point, what I view as the point of my career and the stories I write, which is to point out that climate change and the sort of the tentacles of climate change are really all around us, right in front of us oftentimes, and yet many journalists don't know how to write about it. They don't know how to address it. They don't know how to think about it. And we see that, this is an example of that, in the sense that I was there. I was, seeing the sort of firsthand climate story that was there, that was just completely ignored by other journalists. And so what I hope in this session to do is to just give you a sense of how I think about some of these questions and how I think about finding the climate story when it's not necessarily immediately evident, though I think in this case it was immediately evident, and hopefully maybe inspire you to do that kind of thinking as well. Like I said, I hope it's a dynamic discussion. Please keep chatting using the chat. Later in the session, I'm going to send out a couple articles, invite everyone to just give them a quick skim, and then we can discuss them. I think if the group stays really small, and I'd have to check with the person helping me with the session, but I'd love to just like bring everyone in and have a group discussion. If it gets bigger, we might have to be a little more selective, but I think either way we'll have a good conversation. Okay. Okay, so this is a recent cover that I did that I'm usually sort of reluctant to share covers because I don't want to seem obnoxious, but I'm so proud of this because it, really to get this theme that I'm talking about here, this idea that climate is everything, that it touches everything, that its tentacles are everywhere on the cover of Time was really, I think, something that I'm proud of and have worked for a few years. And so this is a cover from April that really sort of sets the stage for that kind of discussion, right? Thinking about the ways in which climate has really just become a part of everything. And I think in some ways encouraging people to continue to think about those questions and in a deep way. Before we did that cover story, we did a newsletter called 1.5, Everything is Climate. And this I've started in 2019 and wrote on it's basically a bi-weekly basis, but sometimes I did not, because of other news events, did not get it out consistently. But the idea was to start thinking about the way in which the news of the week, the news that everybody was thinking about had a climate angle that wasn't being explored. And this, for me, was really key in sort of just shifting the way I think about these stories to really think about these like interesting intersections, the multifaceted nature of climate change. The exercise of just sitting each week and saying, what's in the news? What is the connection to climate? What are other journalists missing was really, really important. After we did that cover story, we launched a new newsletter, Time, Climate is Everything, which I'm writing along with some of my colleagues. We go through a cycle, and it's sort of the same theme, but given how much climate is in the news these days, it's a little broader, so it doesn't have to be we don't have to stick neatly with the news of the week, but can think about other topics and explore more, just give a little bit of a opportunity to be a little more creative. I share these two because I'm going to use them in part as a frame to help talk about the ways in which I think about connecting climate to other issues. Because in writing these newsletters, I'm often engaging in this exercise of trying to think about how to connect climate to other things. And so the stories that I've written for this newsletter as examples that will help sort of shape and structure this conversation. So there are a few. I'm calling them frames. That I use to structure. So like they're just like little phrases, but the idea is they sort of embody like different approaches, and I've got 4 of them that I use to think about the connections between climate and other things. So the first one I've included here is threat multiplier. And this is a sort of loaded term in some ways because it comes out of the sort of US security language, thinking about the threat of quote unquote of, migration, or the threat of, the various, oftentimes national security concerns. If you look about maybe the situation in the Middle East or whatever. But I think it's a lot broader than that sort of original context. And so when I say threat multiplier, I'm not necessarily thinking in a security context, thinking about the reality that if you take any bad situation and you throw climate change on top of it, it's going to make it worse. And so you can think about that, like in this context, this story here is about the COVID crisis in India and the surge in COVID cases a few months ago. And then, so that was a case where I was writing the newsletter and I, saw this story, surge in COVID cases, and I thought, so, okay, what is the climate connection? Using the threat multiplier sort of approach, you just think, okay, so you have this bad situation, throw climate change on top of it. How is that making it worse? And the fairly obvious way in India is with air pollution, which in large part comes from the burning of fossil fuels, which obviously contributes to climate change, contributes to the really poor air quality, which also leads to worse outcomes from COVID. And so this is the story that resulted from that. And then I also touched on the sort of linked idea that if you address climate change, if you reduce fossil fuel and greenhouse gas emissions, you're also going to reduce those pollutants. And so that's the story that came out. And I think the threat multiplier is really an approach that you can think of when you're thinking about any sort of bad thing that's happening in the news, because chances are, I mean, we had a colleague of mine, who wrote on the Israel-Palestine conflict a few weeks ago and wrote about the way in which climate and drought was increasing conflict in the region, right? There's a connection, a threat multiplier connection, basically with any bad circumstance that's happening in the world. I call this, what's the second or third question? This is a newsletter story written by a colleague about migration. To solve disordered migration, governments need to think about climate change. And the reason why I fit this under this, what's the second or third question, is because climate change is often not immediately obvious. We don't see it or feel it in our everyday lives. Sometimes we do. If there's a hurricane or a drought, et cetera, you might be feeling it. But oftentimes the connections are not immediately obvious. You have to ask a second or third question. And the reason I turned to migration is I did a story about migration several years ago. It wasn't the best. There are lots of great climate migration stories, and I'll share one later. But I was fascinated talking to a lot of the researchers who look at these issues, looking at migration. At the time, there was a surge in migration at the southern border. And the people in power at the time, the Trump administration, and a lot of the commentators were talking about, the crime and the whatever happening in Central America that they said was driving people to the U.S. And when talking to researchers, they would say, well, yes, that's true, but you have to ask the second or third question to get to the root of the problem and the climate link of the problem. Right. So, and what the researcher meant by that is if you ask a migrant who's just, come from, I don't know, from Guatemala City, why did you leave? And they say, well, violence in the city and economic struggles. I couldn't get a job in the city. Okay, that's their first answer. And you say, well, where are you from originally? And then you find out, okay, they're from a rural place, an agricultural community. And you say, well, why did you leave there? And you say, oh, well, I left because of the drought, because I couldn't farm anymore. And so sometimes the questions that get you to climate change need to be directed, and they need to be second, third order questions. They have to penetrate deeper than sort of the first obvious question. And so oftentimes when I'm thinking about what's the climate connection, I think about how do we dig a little deeper. So good question in the chat. Actually, a comment on how exciting it is to see my piece as the main cover story, and it is always very exciting and sometimes still a little surprising to see that. It's like, wow, I can't believe that happened. And I mean, frankly, it's like I feel a little bit of pride, especially when, like I said, in this particular case, because I feel like I'm getting a story out there that really helps people. And so you feel like, okay, I've actually accomplished something in that regard. But but so I appreciate that comment. And then, the question of, do I use the term climate refugees? It's a very good question. I mean, I think not without explanation, right? Because there is a whole discussion and a whole debate about, climate refugees, the concept, et cetera. And so I don't necessarily use that term without really digging in to explain what the conversation is around it. So I wouldn't, in sort of straightforward story about migration, use that term. I do think, I mean, it's an important story in its own right. How do we define climate refugee status? Like, what are the relevant bodies doing to move forward on that? Because clearly there needs to be some recognition of climate refugee status, and particularly given migration is going to change. But I would say that I think it's important to always define terms, and I personally, I'm sort of a slow adopter, I think, with a lot of terms as they've sort of become adopted by activists or by academics, because I just, you want to make sure you see how the term is evolving and is understood. And I think for a reader, often hearing something like climate refugee, if you're not seeped in the area, it might not, you might not know what that means, or you might think it means something different. So yeah, I guess what I would say is I don't necessarily use it without giving it lots of thought. But a very interesting and important question, and I'd actually, perhaps later, I'm going to make a note of it. I'd love to hear Patricia's as well. Okay, so it's the economy stupid, which is a reference to a James Carville line. James Carville was a political advisor to President Clinton, and he said in 1992, it's the economy stupid, to explain how people were voting in the election. And what I mean by this in this context is a little different, but basically, every story about the economy, and most stories have some sort of economic lens or angle. Every story about the economy there's a way to tie it back to climate, and there's sort of two ways that goes. One is, obviously climate change has the potential to really cause a lot of damage to the economy, and so you can start thinking about these questions. If there's a story in the news about the economy, like the same as the threat multiplier approach, but throw climate change in, what does that do? And then you think about the sort of other side of it, which is when you think about the economy, the global economy, it's based on oil, right? Like, it's based on this thing that is causing climate change. And so any story that deals with improving the economy, or the worsening economy, there's a way to tie that back to what the implications are for climate change. And I think sometimes it's more relevant than not, but oftentimes there is a really compelling story. I mean, you think about, how do we decouple emissions from economic growth, right? Like, this is a very central question. The story that I cite here, which was from the newsletter last year, The Economic Principle That Tells Us a Lot About Coronavirus and Climate, was about the cost. At the time of, seems like ages ago, but last year, when the Trump administration was talking about, we need to reopen because of the economy. I wrote this because it's a sort of a similar discussion to the discussion around, we can't fight climate change because of the economy. And what I did is I just said, well, look, there's this economic principle, which a lot of people, activists in particular, don't like. But beyond that, there's this economic principle that is used by the government. It's called a cost-benefit analysis. You look at the costs, you look at the benefits, and it's very clear that locking down in the sort of first stages of a pandemic is more economically beneficial than allowing hundreds of thousands of people to die. And the same goes for climate change, right? Like addressing climate change is going to better the economy more than allowing us fuels. And so that was just one example that uses that sort of approach, thinking through an economic and climate lens to tell a climate story. And the final example here is a better way. And this is a story I wrote in March of last year about the possibilities from COVID recovery to lift us, to drive us to a carbon. But basically, a better way is this idea, this understanding that any policy measure that is going to improve anything, right? Whether that's racial justice or gender rights or economic justice issues, right? Any of these can have a climate angle, and in fact, we're seeing that in the U.S. The administration is talking about incorporating climate into everything. We see that in Europe, they're thinking about how to incorporate climate policy into much of their sort of the EU's Green Deal, which is like a driving force for the bloc. So this idea is like finding the way in which climate ties into any policy that is designed to improve the world. And sometimes that's explicit, like I cited, like the Biden administration or the EU, but sometimes that's a little bit more nuanced. Like sometimes that requires that second or third question to really dig into, what are the implications of, I don't know, of giving girls an education, right? Like that's a policy that makes sense on the face of it because it's a justice issue. It's also a policy that makes sense from a climate perspective, and reasons why later. But in any case, it's thinking about all of those sorts of connections that aren't necessarily immediately evident when you're thinking about this sort of better way. Okay, so here's just an overview in reverse. It's the economy stupid. What's the second or third question and threat multiplier? All of these can stand on their own. Also can be thought of together, as I did, and talking about some of those stories. Oftentimes you want to think about, you always want to think about what's the second or third question, but intersecting with all of these other sorts of frames. Right. Okay. And then it's another good question from Patricia. I will get to that in just one moment. So two thoughts I just want to say when thinking about these frames. Climate justice, right? So I didn't talk explicitly about climate justice. There's a reason for that, which is the same, in my view, as climate change, which is that climate justice should not be a siloed, one slide in a presentation. It should not be one story that you do a year, but rather in any story you do about climate change, you should be thinking about what is the justice element of this? Am I giving, sometimes it might just be a couple paragraphs or one quote, but am I giving due to the way in which these things are going to deal with climate justice and underrepresented communities, people of color, low-income people, et cetera. And really, you could go through all the stories that I just talked about and think about what is the justice angle. And to be totally honest, I'll admit that this is hard, right? Like this is hard because sometimes it can be difficult to weave in the climate justice angle if it doesn't fit tightly with the narrative. But it's really, really important, and I push myself to do better at that. And I encourage everyone else to think about that as well. And the second point is, it's not always the lead, right? Which is to say, I think a key thing for us as communicators, as journalists, is to get past, writing stories that are climate change stories that are solely about climate change and start thinking about the ways in which climate change should be incorporated into other stories, right? So if there is a story about migration and the surge in migration and migrants at the southern border, that doesn't need to be the lead. Climate change is the cause of that, right? But is that incorporated into the story in some way? And so one thing I've tried to do at my newsroom is try to encourage other journalists who aren't experts in climate to just think a little bit about the climate angle. So if I see they're working on something that is related to U.S. foreign policy or gender justice or any of these examples, so the message and say, hey, have you thought about the climate angle? Might be worth a paragraph or two. And so I encourage you to do that. I also encourage you, if you're not a climate journalist and you are working on a story about something else, think about those same frames we talked about and think about, is it worth getting a graph in here that just talks about those climate connections? Because it doesn't need to be the lead of the story. It doesn't need to be the centerpiece of the story to be important. Okay, so I would love to invite questions, reflections. I just talked for a good amount of time. I'm going to, I'll answer it. I'll start with Patricia's question. Seems like the mainstream media tends to highlight the environmental policies driven by Nordic countries. So I'm wondering how they can amplify that perspective and cover good environmental initiatives happening in underrepresented communities. I mean, this is a hugely important question. I mean, just to be 100% frank, I think the problem is in large part, one of representation. It's one of, I'll, again, to be completely honest about it. I think about where does Time have journalists? Where do most news organizations have journalists? And we are definitely overrepresented in Europe and underrepresented in Latin America, for example. I mean, or sub-Saharan Africa, or many places. And so part of the problem is that we aren't hearing these voices because we're not there. And so I think it really takes a conscious effort on the part of journalists to make an effort to reach out and get those perspectives. I mean, this is something that I've done. It's interesting, actually, because not in the cover I shared, but for a previous cover I did last year, in addition to getting the perspective from European officials, U.S. officials, also getting the perspective of, I talked to the president of Costa Rica, I talked to officials from Jamaica, as well as some other officials who were sort of working to engage developing countries. But I think it really is just about making that effort to reach out. And of course, the funny thing is, it's not hard, right? Once you make the effort, it's not hard to actually do that. Those voices are eager to talk, but journalists have to make the effort. I think, I don't know if there's anyone in the audience who has the ability to work on this, but I think it's important also, like organizations that work to help build those bridges, right? Because it can be hard to know, like, what are the NGOs operating in Central America? What are the NGOs operating in sub-Saharan Africa? How do you get in touch with the right officials if you don't have familiarity with the language in whatever place we're talking about? And so I think organizations that work to build those bridges are hugely important, and there are some of them, but there's always more need and space for funding to support that. And so if there's anyone in the audience who somehow has the capability to help with that, I encourage you to do so. But I certainly take Patricia's point, and I hope that journalists do a better job, and I certainly am working on that. Yeah, okay, so let's see. So let me go through. Caro, what about the health angle? Has it been useful for you? What are the challenges and opportunities that you can identify to expand climate change through health framing? Well, I think, as I mentioned, and I think maybe I'm going to close this for now. Okay. I was a health reporter, not for very long, for about a year prior to doing the climate beat. And so I often in the beginning did think about these health angles like a primary focus of mine. the thing about the health angle is that it is so accessible, right? Like this is something that people understand intuitively. Like, how does it affect my health? How does it affect my well-being? And so I think it's a hugely important way to think about telling the climate story. I I do have done fewer stories that are directly about the health angle as of late, though I did mention that India story earlier. But I think it's one of those things that oftentimes, similar to what I was saying about climate, it doesn't need to be the lead. The health angle doesn't need to be the lead of every story, but it's oftentimes important to sort of throw sort of throw a mention at that or reference, because as they use the sort of official term is co-benefits, right? Like you address climate change, you also have the health benefits. And so I think the same is true when you're writing about it. Like if you write about the effects of climate change, the way that dealing with climate change is helpful for the world, you could also just reference that co-benefit. It's also good for human health. And so what are the challenges and opportunities that you can identify to expand climate change through health framing? I guess I don't really have more to say on that, but I think that the more we can talk about health and climate and that intersection, the better. Hugely important. Right. Well, okay. So from Patricia, okay. So can you share a bit of your personal story and what drove you to cover climate stories? So this is always an interesting question and somewhat of an awkward one, in the sense that, if I'm being 100% honest, I didn't really think that much about climate change. I've been doing this for 6 years, so I didn't think about it that much, 8 years ago. What happened is, as I said, I covered politics, I covered health, and at the time I was working at Time writing about health, and somebody who was covering in the environment moved on to do something else, and it was, quite frankly, it was a sort of it was a tough time financially, and so there was a hiring freeze, and they didn't have the ability to hire someone else, and they said, well, this would be a promotion for you. Do you want to cover climate? And to be honest, I was skeptical. I don't have a background in it. I don't know much about it. But I took some time to think about it. I did some reading, and I was like, you know what? There's enough. I could see there's enough sort of intersection with the things that I am interested in to make this a worthwhile thing to do, at least for a little while. And it took a minute, but I quickly realized that, like, all those stories I wanted to do about health, about politics, about race, like, there is a way to do those stories through the climate story that is richer, that isn't being done, and that I think, crucially, from sort of both a career perspective, but also from just a perspective of doing something that is meaningful for the world, that I could see at the time, back in 2015, that this is going to be a much bigger issue, right? And it was hard to know exactly what that timing would be, but we can see it right now, right? Where climate has gone from being something that is an afterthought to being a central policy consideration, a central consideration for activists across the board. Just a really sort of important issue, and an important issue for, like, a very real reason. It's not random. So yeah, it was. I guess I would say it was a little bit random, but I quickly came to understand the gravity of it, and then I think this is important. I brought a lens to it that wasn't the climate lens, so I wasn't thinking about these stories in the same way, and I think that's frankly what has allowed me to succeed, is using these other lenses: the political lens, the race lens, the health lens, et cetera, the geopolitical lens, and apply that and think about these stories in a way that others isn't. And so I always am so encouraged by when I hear young people, students, other journalists covering other things who want to do the beat, and they say, wow, do I need to take a class? Do I need to, I don't know that I'm prepared for this. And I always sort of respond with, I mean, read a book. It's certainly good to do some reading. to learn about the subject matter, read the IPCC reports. But no, you don't need to be an expert in this. And in fact, in some ways, it's better that we have diverse voices who are thinking about this from all sorts of different angles. So I was a long answer to that question, but thank you, Patricia. I'm glad that it was that you found it inspiring. I'm heartened to hear that. Okay, so we have, oh wow, lots of questions coming in. Okay, so from JL Andrapont, being part of growing the climate movement to engage more on the intersecting justice issues affecting us all from a policies perspective is what I do at 350. Beyond the Biden-Harris and the Europe bloc, have you noticed a more prevalent justice lens to any climate policymaking, especially in the global South context? How has it changed how you cover climate, if at all? Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think in many ways, the climate justice, the justice lens has been prevalent in the global South for a long time. I mean, you think back to the Paris Agreement and the inclusion of the reference to 1.5 and the need to really ambitiously tackle climate change. That's something that originated from small island states talking about the need to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive, right? Like this is all about justice. And so, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest, and I hope I didn't suggest that, that this justice framing is coming from the global North at all. In fact, it's very much something that came from the other direction. I think I have done, I did a cover story, actually, I think my first cover. So one of my first cover stories about this sort of effort that bubbled up in the global South, and how these countries that one doesn't necessarily think about, particularly small island developing states, had become influential in the climate world because of their moral authority and the real issues that they face. I think that the truth is that because of the way that these countries are, many of these countries, their sort of economic position, that justice perspective is really crucial in international framings, like when they're talking about finance, when they're talking about loss and damage, adaptation, etc. I think it oftentimes is harder on sort of a domestic policy front. And obviously there are places that are doing it really well. I mentioned Costa Rica, but Costa Rica is a relatively wealthy country, even though it's a Central American country that but I think for a lot of countries that even if they're aware and pushing on the global stage, it's hard to really get some of the sort of justice-oriented policies that we're talking about. And so we still see places that have subsidies for fossil fuels, et cetera, which really, I think, most objective analysis can agree that that's, these are bygone, these are policies that are not good for people, they don't serve people, and yet there's still this difficulty to really get them out in these contexts. So I hope that answered your question, but yeah, totally, I think, from my perspective, it's so important to cover the way in which the justice angle, looking at the global South. It's important to name check, to acknowledge that the Biden administration did not invent justice, and in fact, I did several stories about the way in which activists here in the U.S., 350 among them, but other activists have made that issue, have elevated justice here, and it's important to think really about the sort of global origins in the global South. So very, very important question. Yeah, so this is, so Roberto asks about editorial changes, covering, and how we talk about covering climate, including using language like climate crises, like The Guardian does. So this is a really, I have a sort of maybe have my own opinions about this, right? Which are maybe distinct from what a lot of people think. I certainly, I say the climate crisis now. I was hesitant to adopt it. I mean, this is something that I referred to earlier when talking about climate refugees. And the reason is you don't want the language to be a distraction. And, do I believe that we have a climate crisis? Absolutely, of course. This is obvious. But what I would hate is for somebody to read my article and to see climate crisis and get all caught up, saying, oh, why is he using that word, whatever, and totally distract from the point of the story. So I guess all of that is to say is that I try to use the most precise language possible. And I think sometimes that means stepping back from language like climate crisis if it might be a distraction, or as I said, a climate refugee, if that might distract or throw off the reader, and there's a more precise way to say it. I think with regard to climate crisis specifically, I think we've sort of crossed that bridge. I feel like, like clearly we're in a crisis, and I don't think that it's the same as when the Guardian first adopted it. And of course, the fact that they adopted it has fostered that sort of rhetorical approach in a way that I can now feel comfortable using it without feeling like I might distract readers. I mean, but in my view, there are a lot of things, sort of what qualifies as the Green New Deal, I think, is another one of those questions where you have senators, politicians saying, well, I support the Green New Deal, but not that Green New Deal. And then, activists who say, well, the Green New Deal is this, and others who say it's that. And my view is, let's avoid that question. Like it doesn't, if a policy adheres to, X part of the Green New Deal resolution and not Y, like that's what's important is the substance of the policy, and not whether we can call it X or Y. And so I don't know, I guess all of which is to say is I try to avoid these debates in favor of just like, what is the most precise way to say it to foster understanding for the reader. Yeah, so it's a very long answer to a relatively simple question, but I hope that's insightful. Okay, let's see, from Patricia, how do audiences respond to your stories? And how do you use social listening tools to develop stories that generate interest from your audiences? How important is solutions journalism covering climate? Okay, good questions. How do audiences respond to my stories? Well, I mean, I certainly, well, I guess I would say this. Obviously, my goal is to inform, I mean, this is just what I was talking about before, inform readers, advance understanding. At the same time, though, I don't approach a story necessarily thinking, certainly not how can I get the most clicks, but just it's about engagement and sort of a more holistic approach. And so I definitely I'm very much attuned to what readers say in an email, right? If I get just stories will get thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands views, but getting 3 emails that say the same thing is something that I will take note of, right? Even in the scheme of all of these, people who are viewing the story, and really take to heart. And so there's a diverse set of responses, right? I mean, sometimes the responses are, wow, that's crazy. I didn't know that. Sometimes, I mean, there's, the sort of obvious, and this is a little bit of I sort of roll my eyes at, but the obvious climate denial, which we get, it just is inevitable. But yeah, I mean, I think what else can I say about this? Well, the other thing I would say is, while we do have the ability to check our sort of clicks, that isn't something I do regularly. But what we do get, and I'm very proud of this, Time has developed a engagement metrics, right? Of not looking at how many clicks, but how are people, are people reading the whole story? Are they sharing it? Are they, finding ways to see that, like, did people actually appreciate the journalism that we're doing? Because we want our goal to be not just, can we, get 1 million people to read it, but can we get, 1 million people to actually engage and understand it? And I am very proud that a lot of the climate stories, some of which I've referenced, have gotten very high engagement metrics, which is to say that people really read them and appreciate them. And I would like to think that's because I'm telling, and I think our sort of growing climate team is telling us the story in a slightly different way. It's hopefully a little thought-provoking, but also accessible for a general audience. Let me see. And okay, and then social listening tools to develop stories. Yeah, we don't really do that so much, to be honest. I mean, I think, the way we think about stories is, thinking about the news, thinking about what people are talking about, sort of broadly. But, I know there's a lot of sort of technology that allows, to better, sort of follow what's being discussed on social. And I don't think I mean, maybe it's that we're not that sophisticated, but also I don't know that really drives our approach so much as thinking about how can we move the conversation forward in a little more abstract sense. Final question here is about how solutions journalism, how important is solutions journalism when covering climate? This is a big question. I mean, I think it's hugely important to write about the solutions that matter, because they matter, right? And we need people to understand that there is a approach to address these issues, that not all is immediately lost, even though in many ways we have crossed a threshold in some ways, and we're going to face some of the irreversible effects of climate change. But I think it's hugely important to cover the solutions. That said, there is sort of a strain of thinking, which is like, well, solutions journalism is what engages people. It's like what drives people to action. And I don't know that I don't really know that that's true. I mean, I think we see that people engage with a diverse set of stories. I think for me personally, I try to incorporate solutions into a story that might be about a very serious problem, or about in any other story I write, rather than trying to write stories that are entirely about solutions. And I think for me, that's just largely because I find that more interesting. I mean, it can be, frankly, a little boring to write about, this new technology or, this new policy without really delving into the texture of the challenges that have created the need for that policy. So, I guess in my view, again, it goes back to that line I said about, doesn't need to be the lead. It can just be a part of the story, and it should be a part of the bigger story. So, okay, so Justin, what is the Uproot rooting for? Would this include a movement to decentralize the climate/environmental health science health coverage from the US Nordic Cosmovision? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would phrase it exactly that way, but yeah, the Uproot project is the sort of the goal of the Uproot project is to elevate. Well, it's sort of twofold. One is to elevate journalists, environmental journalists of color, to help increase the pipeline, because frankly, the climate movement, the environmental movement, is a very very white space, and that includes journalists, perhaps even more so with journalists. And so we want to help create opportunities for journalists of color to find jobs, to find opportunities to write in this space. And we want to do that for for the sake of these journalists, one, and two, because we want to improve coverage of these issues, right? So we want we believe that a more diverse set of perspectives will better be able to understand, the relevance of environmental justice, or many of the issues, and to see them in different ways that a lot of white journalists, might be missing. And so, yes, I think you said it slightly differently than I phrased it, but I think that's totally right. I think we're also, it's interestingly we're trying to figure out what our approach is beyond the U.S. because right now we, are a U.S. organization with a steering committee that is entirely based in the U.S. But we want to think more broadly about this global North divide. How can we better incorporate voices from the global South, and what's the best method to do that? I mean, there's just purely logistical challenges. It's just one thing I think that we're trying to figure out. But yes, the Uproot project is, I think you said it just slightly differently. Okay, so let's see. So have you heard of the disaster justice movement, and what are your thoughts on it? Incorporating a disability lens to climate justice, climate policy making, climate harm. I don't know that I have, but I'm not sure I have a good answer. So I think I'm going to avoid answering because I don't know that I have fully formed thoughts that are worth sharing. I mean, incorporating disability lens to climate justice. I mean, yeah, I mean, clearly, that's relevant and makes sense. I don't know. I'll have to think about it more. So I appreciate the question on disaster justice and the disability lens. And in fact, perhaps maybe even it might make sense. This might be a good opportunity. I've been talking about promoting somebody to chat here. So I don't know if JL, if you would want to oh, thank you. Oh, thank you for sharing that link. In fact, yeah, that's very helpful. But JL, I don't know if you'd like to join and just to chat briefly, if because we can promote you too if you'd like. You can just let me know in the chat. Because that might be helpful. Okay. Okay, so now let's see if I can actually do that, and I might have to ask Natalia to help me. Let's see. Right to video call schedule. Okay. Well, while I figure this out, yes, the Uproot project is very very interesting, and I encourage, we'd love to get more people involved. So if you're interested, there's a form on the website. You can fill out the form. You can also send me an email. I'd be happy to help others get involved. As I think it's very important, and we're still learning and growing and thinking about how we can better advance these ends and serve everybody. So if there's the thoughts that you have, would love to hear them. Hi JL. I don't know if you want to just share your thoughts, what you were thinking about, and yeah.
Hi, Justin. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to just kind of expound on my question in the chat. This has been a very interesting presentation, and I really appreciate your thoughts and how you're utilizing the importance of journalism to connect climate to everything, and that's also my background. So to that end, I was recently watching a different panel with a bunch of disability justice advocates who are concerned about the intersection of disability issues and climate issues, and they started talking about disaster justice. And it's, I would say, a lesser known aspect of how climate change is impacting everything. They told a story about a disabled person in Houston during a hurricane. His area had been flooded out, had no access to power. All of his clothes were covered in, hurricane floodwaters, sewage, etc. So he had to wear the same clothes, same shoes, etc. And eventually, he's in a chair, and eventually he had to go have his leg amputated because of being stuck in an area where he couldn't get out because he didn't have the flexibility of funds to be able to exit when a disaster was coming, was stuck in his place, and eventually, again, like I said, had to have his leg amputated. And so it's one of those things of, it really, made me start thinking about what are the further lesser known stories inside of the climate crisis discussion, and how are we as an organization 350 that is committed to growing the climate movement, especially around climate justice, how are we incorporating these voices, these issues into our work? And so that's why I just wanted to ask you, like, have you heard some stories that you'd like to share, or have you started thinking about this? What are your thoughts on this, was my kind of question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. It's a great question, and great perspective. So, I mean, the truth is, I haven't done, any stories that were specifically, about disaster justice, about using the disability lens, and I should. I think, and I think it's also a perspective, to my point earlier, and this is where I say, constantly having to push myself, because these things aren't necessarily sort of easy to fit into the sort of bigger narrative that's ongoing, but there needs to be sort of a push to, even if it's getting a few graphs in there to really explain that, it's something that we need to do, and looking for the right opportunity to do that. So, I'm trying to think if I know of any specific stories along those lines. I mean, I honestly can't think of any that I've encountered, and I'm just running, and there must be something, but I'm not thinking of anything offhand. But I mean, it's a hugely important perspective, and I appreciate the question, because it'll make me think about how I can do that the next time there's an opportunity. So thank you. Okay. So we've got some great responses to the Uproot project, and I would love, you can shoot me a note. I would love to continue the conversation. I think, because as I said, we're just thinking, like, how do we even grapple with dealing with different time zones, although actually pretty easy on that regard, but just how do we coordinate this sort of international component? So to Jacinia, please do email me. And then to Roberto, yes. So at this point, we do have international journalists who are a part of the network. But the challenge right now is we're trying to figure out, so you're part of the network, and that's great, and we want that. How do we serve you best, and how do we best incorporate you so that, like, it's fruitful for everyone? And so please do fill out the form, shoot me an email, and if you have thoughts on that question, that's great. If not, we're going to figure it out as we go. But it's great to just have you part of the network and sort of connected for now. So from Caro, what is your experience with other journalists that usually cover other beats? Has this been helpful to expand the coverage and approach climate as a multifaceted issue? Yes, absolutely. I mean, so it's interesting, right? Because when I started this, as I was saying, 6 years ago, I don't think there was that much interest. But right now, everybody wants a piece of the climate beat. Everybody wants to to think about how their stories intersect. And I think for a lot of people, it's interesting because it's sort of a learning curve, and people are sort of understanding connections that have always been there, but they've just starting to see. And so a lot of times people are coming to me saying, how have you heard about, from the Pentagon report, have you heard about, what the Department of Defense is doing on XYZ climate thing? And say, oh, yeah, well, let's talk about it, and we can talk it through. So I think there's definitely interest in collaborating. One thing that we're doing, which I think I'm really excited about, is using that newsletter I mentioned. I write it along with a few other journalists who are on the growing climate team. But importantly, what we're trying to do is trying to think about how can we get reporters who aren't climate reporters at all to write for that newsletter, to write about their beat and climate. And so, know if I should say, or we'll have our first example of that next week on this newsletter, where we're going to have a reporter who's an economics reporter who did a story about something that isn't necessarily a climate story but has a climate element, going into the climate elements of that story that she did for the newsletter that is focused around climate. And so I think this is hugely important to shifting the way people think about these things. Is like, you don't have to be a climate reporter. You don't have to know. You don't have to read the IPCC reports. You don't have to know the science in depth, but you should be thinking about this as just one facet in your job. And so I'm hopeful. I think the newsletter is a great structure to really encourage that. And so I would encourage other newsrooms, to think about what is the sort of thing to institutionalize and really foster sort of a change in thinking. I mean, the newsletter is perfect for us, but there might be other ways to foster and institutionalize that kind of collaboration, because I think it's so helpful. And I think the reality is, climate reporters, like having even in place institutions that have tons of climate reporters, we're never going to be enough to really cover all of these facets. We need to get others who are not focused entirely on climate to understand and think about these issues. So I guess the sort of long and short of it was difficult at first, but it's so much opportunity now, and I encourage others to do the same. Okay, so from Chantal Flores, I'm not a climate reporter, but in my reporting, I keep hearing from people who are being impacted by various climate issues that, for instance, not even the Mexican government recognizes. Right. Yeah. Do you have any tips on how we can dig deeper on stories when there's not enough scientific or academic investigations to understand climate change's specific reasons? Yes, this is makes total sense, and is a really, really interesting and difficult challenge, because oftentimes, as a reporter, we want to validate. It's hard to sort of rely entirely on what the intuition is on the ground without validating. And I'll say, like, I had very difficult challenges going to communities, hearing experiences, and trying to figure out, like, how do I report these experiences and bring the science in, when the science is always going to be behind, in a sense, right? Specifically, I'm thinking about climate gentrification, right? Which is, I remember going to Miami in 2015, maybe. I was early when I was on this beat, hearing about climate gentrification. The concept hadn't really caught on. It hadn't been studied from an academic perspective, but everybody on the ground was talking about it. And I was just, flustered, because when I would call the academics and ask them about the, like, climate gentrification, like, do you see it happening? And, you get a long answer of like, well, we don't have the data, blah, blah, blah. And, I didn't write the story because I was like, I don't know how to validate it. And it's hard, because like I should have, and there's that sort of difficult challenge of like getting the sort of authorities to support what you can really see happening on the ground sometimes. And so I think it's an interesting challenge. And what I wish I had done in that story was find a better way to really speak to people's experiences, and acknowledge the sort of need, or the need for further study, and the sort of academic sort of process that was still playing out, while still acknowledging what people were experiencing. And so, I think that might be the way to go when you're talking about, in this particular context of talking about, people where the government isn't recognizing it, to just write about the experience, to write about the fact that the government hasn't recognized it, but that there is, these are the steps XYZ that could be taken scientifically or from sort of an academic approach that would help validate what you're hearing on the ground. And I think if you do it delicately, there's a way to not undermine people's experiences, but also to acknowledge that, we don't quite know everything there is to know yet. And that's important, right? I mean, that's the nature. We don't know exactly what climate change is going to look like. We don't know every little detail scientifically, so it's okay. But I think it's important to find a way to thread that needle. So you said, you hope that the question makes sense. It makes total sense. I hope that my answer makes sense, because this is a tricky question that I think we all are wrestling with. So very, very, very good question. Okay, so another question: how do you cover stories that link corruption with climate? In Latin America, it's quite common that governments grant contracts to private companies as a way to move money illegally, etc. And oftentimes, those contracts have huge environmental impact in rural communities. It's a very good question. I mean, I think, this is trying to think of examples of stories I've done with that specifically. I mean, I think, yeah, I think you just have to write it sort of straightforward. And point out, especially if you have the details, the sort of the receipts, so to speak, that sort of prove this out. I think you sort of write it straightforward as an investigation. I think it's hard because, unless you do the work to really verify that, like you don't want to accuse, reference corruption without the, the real, evidence to support it. And particularly, dealing with the global South and particular countries, people are understandably sensitive to, particularly me as a journalist in the U.S. for a mainstream outlet to just say, oh, well, there's corruption, so you have to be very careful and validate all of those, those sorts of links that you're talking about. But I think writing it straightforward is the way to go. I also think, to the point that has sort of been a theme here is prioritizing those local voices on the ground who are actually experiencing these impacts. The one story that comes to mind that I did was related to a coal-fired power plant in Kenya, and in this case there was involvement from the U.S. and Trump affiliates, etc. But the sort of the most important element that makes that story work in some ways is the fact that the people on the ground were going to be impacted were so opposed. And I think that's the way I would probably walk into that story, is like finding the people who are going to be hurt by a decision, and then moving backwards, because that's the most compelling part. I'm not sure I quite answered the question, but I hope I did. It's a very interesting, hesitancy with the ivory tower. Totally understand that point. And yeah, academia moves at a different pace, and it's an important perspective. But as journalists, it's part of my job, and it can be a challenging part. But to kind of get ahead of that, right? To get ahead of what's published and sort of push the envelope in a way that an academic isn't. That's just not their job. Okay, so another question from Roberto, I don't know if we have time yet, but I'm curious about how did you cover, or are you covering your climate stories during the pandemic? I've just finished a podcast about coral reefs and the impacts of the 2019 oil spill here in Brazil, and it's quite challenging to interview some people remotely. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I love getting out into the field and talking to people. I mean, there's a lot of criticism about, sort of parachute reporting, going into a place that's unfamiliar and doing a story. But I have to say, I mean, this, of course, with sensitivity to understanding people's experiences on the ground, like I think it is very important that journalists engage with people, in their area of coverage, and even if that is only a week, like that week is still informative to the way we think and the way we write, and I think it's hugely important. So it was very challenging during COVID to do that, particularly because I mentioned this earlier, the story I wrote last year, and I referenced Costa Rica and Jamaica, and I said it's not that hard to get people on the phone, but it's not that hard to get officials on the phone, right? And while it's great to include voices, like the president of Costa Rica, or the minister of, I can't remember which minister it was in Jamaica actually, but a minister in Jamaica, those are important, but not the only voices, and it is very hard to get voices, from the local people on the ground who are actually experiencing things. So I think truthfully, the reality is that was just lost. There were some times I did something related to Poland. We hired a stringer who was better able to reach people on the ground, but even then, even internally within Poland, it was, there are restrictions and complications. So the short answer is, I think we really lost something. We have lost something. We continue to lose. The pandemic is ongoing. I mean, of course, feel very fortunate, in the U.S. to be vaccinated and to have. I think we have the opportunity to travel domestically anyway. That's finally coming back, and hopefully, the rest of the world will be in that position soon. But I mean, the long and short of it is, I think we've just lost something, and it's hard to get that full story. And I hope we can get back to it. Great. Okay. Wow. Well, I'm happy to answer other questions. What I'd planned was just, I mean, I have some other stories I could run through. I was going to just share a link to a few stories from, a couple from Time, and then some others that I thought were interesting and worth discussing. I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to do that. The idea was just to maybe, get people to spend a few minutes reading and then reflect on them. It's almost like I want to create a poll to see what would be the best, what everyone would like to see. Okay, here's another question. Questions are easier than sharing these links, just because I really want to make this most informative to you. And like, I'm not sure it's the best use of time to since everybody here has clearly thought a lot about these things, to just send you these links. But I'll answer this question for now. Let's see. What would you need to improve your climate reporting? What are the most frequent obstacles that you find? Good question. Let me just pause and think about that. Well, it's a very good question. I think, I mean, I think the challenge, the obstacles, I mean, there's always the obvious obstacles, working on a story right now where somebody who was supposed to connect me to the voices on the ground has disappeared, and I don't know whether he's trying to make it hard for me because he doesn't like the story anymore, or I don't know what's going on. And there's always these questions with sourcing and trying to get people to talk, and I think that's just a frequent obstacle. And I don't think that's specific to climate. I think that's just a journalist's problem. But I think with climate specifically, as I've sort of said, the sort of theme of this conversation and of my remarks here has been the reality that climate touches everything and is a part of everything. And to really take a sort of like intersectional, multifaceted approach to covering these things, in my mind, requires some depth of knowledge in all of these areas, and that's impossible, right? Like I read the newspaper like in full every day because I'm trying to like open my mind to everything that could be connected to climate that people aren't seeing, and also trying to stay up on top of the climate news, and also trying to stay up on the climate literature, in academic journals, and trying to keep an eye on everything. I think that's sort of my unique approach to this beat in some ways, because a lot of places you silo the beat. You cover renewable energy, you cover environmental justice, you cover climate diplomacy, and in doing those silos, you miss these intersections. But it is so hard to try to keep track of all of this information. And so I think for me, finding a way to digest information more quickly, to really stay on top of things is what I need to improve, and what I think one of the biggest obstacles is just not being able to keep my eye on everything that's happening. And I think that's a challenge for everyone, right? Because again, you're missing the intersections if you're covering the beat in the siloed approach, but also there's not time. There's not time to really read and absorb everything. And so I don't really know what the answer is, because I hope journalists can get a better, more comprehensive sense and be able to see these connections better. But I also am aware that, like, personally, like I'm fortunate because I'm not under pressure to write every single day or even necessarily every week. So I have the time to like read and just call people and sort of take a step back. But I know that not everybody is that fortunate, and so it's like, how do we find a way to help people see these connections and links without just requiring them to just be reading 24/7. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it's a really interesting thought. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe instead of sending these links, because I had done that with the intention that would be around the hour mark, and I don't like, by the time people took the time to read these links and reflect on them, we wouldn't really have much time left anyway. So I think with the remaining 30 minutes or so, I mean, please continue to ask questions. That's more interesting to me than just for me to keep talking, but I can just talk a little bit more about some of the stories that I've done that are sort of on this theme. So let me see if I can share my screen again. Actually, I've had a change of heart. I don't know is there anybody, like, we're a relatively small group, and I just feel like you all have interesting thoughts, and I think maybe what would be more interesting is to promote some of you to be panelists, to just get your thoughts, rather than for me to just keep talking. So yeah, I don't know if, I mean, maybe I mentioned earlier to Patricia, I don't know if you might, I think it was about climate refugees. I don't know. Are you interested in just talking about that? Um, if so, you know, or really, yeah. I mean, as they say, as Clementina says, you know, if you want to click share audio and video, if you have something you want to contribute, talk about, I would love to do that. I'll give it a couple seconds or 30 seconds. If not, I can go back to talking. I'm totally comfortable talking, but I also would love to hear from more of you. So please join if you'd like. Anyone? Patricia, would you like to talk about climate refugees, or I don't know. I mean, even Roberto, would you like to talk about the podcast? Anybody? I'd love just to have, you know, some company just for a minute, but I'm okay if I have to keep talking. Okay.
Hello, are you listening to me?
Hello. Yes. Hello.
Oh, sorry, I don't know if my camera is on or not. Let me see here. Oh, okay. I think I have some problems with my camera, but yeah, I did a podcast last this year about like the 2019 in Brazil. I don't know if you followed that, but it was like the biggest oil spill disaster I and it was quite challenging to interview some people, especially some who have say advice skills in their life, collecting a type of mollusco. I don't know how to say that in it's a very common activity here in the north of Brazil. And those people, they don't have like access to the internet. They don't have access to even like a computer or something like that. And it was quite challenging to put those people in my podcast because I was working entirely remotely, and I had like to interview some people that they know those modificators, and then they arranged the interview with them. And but finally, I had like the
I don't know if it's just me, but I lost you. And finally, okay. Well, I think we lost Roberto, but I guess I'll give him a second to come back. Okay. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I mean, I was curious to hear how he solved that problem because, you know, yeah, I mean, it's one thing. I mean, I can't even imagine for my colleagues who do video and, you know, how do you begin to approach, you know, reaching people and doing your job, you know, in the middle of a pandemic. So it's very challenging, and I was curious to hear how he solved that because it's yeah, I mean it's fascinating. Okay, anyone else? Would anyone else like to speak? I'm open. I'll just give a few more seconds before I go back to rambling. Okay, here we go. um, no problem at all. Maybe I'll answer this question, and then if that'd be great. Is there any climate journalist that you admire, and or whose coverage you follow, or any media outlet that you would recognize? Those are very good questions. I mean, I think there are a lot of journalists I admire. I mean, I think that there's a lot of and that are doing good work, and I think I don't know. I mean, so to pick one, I guess I would say this is that I like I said before, I try to read a diverse set of news on climate, and so a lot of what I do is reading through the newsletters that sort of aggregate climate news, and I'm making sure that I go through to make sure that I'm getting a diverse perspective rather than focusing specifically on the journalists. But there are a lot of people whose perspectives I'm always glad to hear. I mean, I think Samini Samgupta at the New York Times does a great job on the international front, and sort of making sure that there are good global voices. I mean, I think that there are a lot of people. I mean, that's one sort of. The New York Times is one thing, and then there are people like Yesenia Funes she's at Atmos now, who has sort of a different approach, but is thinking about these sorts of intersectional issues and writing about them. She's an editor now, but prioritizing. I really admire her work. That's sort of the spectrum, right? From somebody at the New York Times to Atmos, which is more of an upstart organization. And I think I try to follow everything in between. I also think it's important to try to make sure that I'm not getting my climate news from one journalist or another, or one outlet or another, but rather making sure that I get a good cross section. But so what I would say is, if you're looking for a media, rather than recommend a media outlet, I would say, subscribe to, well, Climate Nexus has a great newsletter, for example, that is just a digest of like everything, not everything, but like lots of things. And so you can really pick and choose and see everything that is being written about and who's writing it, and then sort of just get a sort of diverse perspective, mix it up sometimes, right? So yeah, great. Yeah, is fantastic. And it's not something that a lot of people necessarily know about, but their newsletter is just like, it's great because, you can read one day, you can read the New York Times, another day you can read Earther, another day you can read the AP, and it's just, you mix it up, you get a diverse set of perspectives. So yeah, I think I try to follow some of the like more wonky, like Climate Home News, which writes about like international climate politics. Let's see, Carbon Brief also has a sort of it's European focused, but politics overview. There's even Power Shift Africa, is like a weekly newsletter about what's happening in Africa and climate politics. I don't know. I guess I would say, as I was saying before, I really try to be comprehensive. But Climate Nexus, I would say, is a great newsletter to start with. Okay, can you talk about pitching climate stories? Any tips? I mean, I think thematically it fits a lot with what I was saying, which is, the sort of theme of this discussion, which is like stories that are rooted in not in climate science, not in carbon, but in people, and the way people are experiencing climate change, the way that policy shifts related to climate change are going to affect people, like centering pitches around those stories is crucial, right? Because that's what compels an editor much more so than, especially if they're not a climate editor, much more so than, you know, these sort of seemingly abstract things that are hard to get your head around. The other thing I would say, and you know, it depends on the outlet, but there's this this risk in writing about climate, which we often see of you know, writing the same story over and over again. And I think the way that comes about is, you know, there's so much in climate, there's so much that's happening that I feel like there's often, like, when something bubbles up, there's an opportunity to sort of like see the same story again. And so I think there does need to be a focus on thinking, like, how can I move this particular story forward, and sort of justify, you know, to an editor who's always focused on, you know, the need for news, like, how is this story different? How is it moving the ball forward? And it's really tricky, right? Because there's this issue, right? Like, 2 million people in the United States don't have access to clean water. And so when a community, you know, in the US loses water for weeks on end, there's the question, you know, that an editor could ask, you know, when millions of people don't have access to water. And that's right. I'm disagreeing with that. I think we need to move past that way of viewing news. At the same time, if I'm being honest and realistic, I don't think I'm going to be able to change that sort of editorial perspective, you know, overnight. And so I think it's important when pitching a climate story to think about, okay, how do I check that box so that when I'm talking about these people who have lost water for a few weeks, I can really say to the editor, this is why it's different, and this is why we should be covering it right now. Because there is always going to be an angle that moves the ball forward. You just have to make sure that you're presenting it in a way that really distinguishes this story from other stories that might be similar. So anchored in people, find new ways to make sure you're moving the ball forward. Those would be my two off-the-cuff pieces of advice. But I mean, I could talk more about that if you have follow-up questions, because I realize that that's just sort of my off-the-cuff response. So, Roberto, do you want to? Okay, what about international stories? Well, I guess I'm curious what in particular about international stories. I think this is a great space to be, you know, to write about international climate issues, because obviously everyone understands that climate is an international issue that affects people in the global south more immediately than in the global north. Though, of course, I think it's important not to lose sight of, right, without hitting a U.S. angle. It's important to lose sight that, you know, that what's happening in the global south, like, we're not, the U.S., Europe, it's not immune to these things that are happening in the global south. But I think it's a great place to be, because the truth is that organizations like Time, most U.S. outlets don't have the resources, frankly, to have correspondents in most places. You know, our footprint in Latin America is very small. Our footprint in sub-Saharan Africa is very small. And so, you know, if you have perspective and experience and sources in the place, like, you obviously have a leg up. And I think there's an appetite for those stories. I think with regard to the US angle, so my approach when writing these stories, you know, in my sort of experience reporting abroad, is that, yeah, okay, so they want a US angle. But the US angle can be the last section of the story. For example, the story I alluded to earlier about the small island developing states and the role they're playing in international climate talks. Like, I mean, I guess there is the obvious connection of the role they're playing in climate talks, but you know, that story weaved in the sort of experience being there on the ground, and I visited a village that had relocated. And the US angle with regard to some of the sort of experiential elements was that sort of third part, that reminder that, you're not, the US isn't immune, the US isn't, disconnected. I mean, sure, the US might have more money, but the things that happen there are, in the South Pacific and lots of developing countries and in the global South, like these are going to have ripples that hit in the US. And it doesn't, in my view, doesn't need to be the focus of the story. Few graphs that, if you're a US reader who's like, I don't care about, what's happening there, that it hits you over the head. Actually, we're all connected. And, by not being concerned about what's happening there, you're hurting yourself in a way. And I think you could play that up in a pitch. I mean, I often I don't know how long your pitches are, but it's something that I would include in a pitch as sort of the sort of like part, like the sort of like a couple sentences towards the end. Like, look, by the way, also I'm going to flick at these implications for the US, but it's not the central part of the story. And it's worked for me. I don't know. It might be hard. I don't know whether how much appetite there is for that. But I do think I think being focused on climate in a place that isn't the US or Western Europe, I think is probably a really good opportunity to do some good stories that people would be interested in commissioning. But that's my hunch, not my. I'm not in a position to. I haven't been necessarily making those decisions. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. Caro asks about this language debate about crisis, not crisis, but also in some places the debate around focusing on individual versus systemic change stories. What are your thoughts around this? Well, I have strong opinions about this. I mean, if I'm just being totally honest here, I do not like individual change stories. I sometimes have had to do them, but I don't like them. I think that's, gives people a misguided sense what is, about how change happens. Having said that, I think I've really come to appreciate the role that individual change can make in pushing for systemic change. And I think there's a role for stories around individual change that couch that as like a precursor to systemic change, as a way to push for systemic change. So if an individual, I don't know, buys something sustainable, that creates a signal that people actually care about sustainable things. I mean, I think that's true, but I do really, really resist the idea of doing stories that are solely rooted in individual, or giving that impression. And I think that in the time that I've been doing this, in the beginning, I think there were a lot of people who were like, oh, what can I do? And can you write a story about what I should be doing? And I think that's shifted. I think people have moved away from that to some degree. Not everybody, but I think that the narrative has shifted, and people are not talking about that as much as they used to. And I think that's a really, really positive development. Do I think audiences are more or less interested in climate stories now? Well, certainly more interested than when I started doing this. So when I started doing this, in 2015 in the US, this was the end of the Obama administration. I think there was a sense from a lot of people that, okay, no, there's progress. There's progress. Things are happening. It might not be happening as fast as I'd like, but it's sort of like en route, and they've got it. And Hillary Clinton will pick it up, and it'll just all everything will get better. The surge in climate interest began really right when Trump took office, because I think people who thought they didn't have to worry about these things saw, the Trump wrecking ball, the Trump, tear it all down approach, and they became concerned. And so I think there was an uptick in interest in climate in 2017. I think that the interest it was pretty steady throughout most of the Trump administration. And I think sort of globally, I think, in 2018, the IPCC report changed the conversation. I mean, I was shocked by to my knowledge, had never really thought much about climate change internally at a time, but also just in conversation in life, who were all of a sudden talking and thinking about climate change. Really remarkable how a report helped change the conversation. And of course, activists as well, whether that's the Sunrise Movement, the Fridays for Future movement, of course, 350, others elevated that conversation as well. And really 2018, 2019, it felt like people had woken up. And of course, COVID hit. That was like a blip in, I think, interest. But it's interesting. I think that COVID awoke something. It reminded some people, not everybody, certainly there are some people with their head in the sand, but it reminded some people that you can't take for granted the sort of current reality, right? That just because most people in the global north and in the US have sort of lived the same existence, with some changes for most of their life, that's not guaranteed. And I think COVID awoke that in people, and I think that gave people a reminder that climate might be similar. And so I think there is. I mean, I don't even think it's borne out in, I said I don't follow the numbers and I don't closely, but it's borne out in interest in climate stories, right? People are reading about climate stories in a way they certainly weren't doing in 2015. And I think COVID is part of that. Very long answer to that question. Okay, was there a climate story that you worked on that surprised you, meaning the angle, outcome, full picture of the story was not what you expected? I mean, all the time. I trying to think. I'm working on one right now. I probably shouldn't talk about it yet, but I think let's see. Let's think of another one here. I mean, I think it's always interesting, challenging. Just everything is always more complicated than it appears, and oftentimes, I mean, just to be frank, right? Here's a story. I went to a town that had committed to going 100% renewable, and I was hoping to write a nice story about industrial town that was making strides on climate, and they were thinking about environmental justice considerations as part of that. And I was excited. I was like, oh, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna write this sort of feel good story. And I got there and started talking to people, started really looking into what was happening, and realized that totally unprepared. They had no plan. They had, given the sort of realities of their contract with the utility, it was just they made this commitment and there wasn't really a viable plan. Not technically. Technically, it's not a problem, right? This is the thing with renewable energy and the transition, is that we know how to do it. It's just that the political strictures are such that it's all getting tied up in knots. And so I was like surprised and sort of disheartened, frankly, that I had to write a story that was not negative, but just it was just a lot more, just it was like, this is going to be a lot harder than they say it is, and they've made this commitment, and maybe it will happen, maybe it won't, probably won't. Yeah, and so that was a hard one. And it was also hard because I mean, the people there were trying to do the right thing, and they're caught in a system, again, to go back to the systemic things, that they're caught in a system that really doesn't want them to succeed at what they're doing. So yeah, so that was one where the story I ended up writing was not what I wanted to write, and was sort of surprising. And I think like that happens all the time. I mean, there's so many interests involved, and oftentimes, the people that you want to be the good guys, so to speak, in the story often end up being just complicated, more complicated than so yeah, that's an example. We have 5 minutes left. I can't believe when I was planning this, and I was like, I came up with my presentation that was supposed to take like 45 minutes. I was like, how are we going to keep this discussion going? Like I said, I've had those links for everyone to read, but I hope this was more interesting. I think, I don't mind talking. So for me, it was more interesting, but I don't know if there's any one last question. Otherwise, I feel like I might just end early. And I believe there's another climate session following this, like a plenary session. So I'd encourage you all to do that. I appreciate the kind words, and yeah, it's heartening to me that this is, that it was, inspiring in some way or helpful in some way. And I think I put my email addresses there. So if you want to reach out to me about Uproot, love to hear that, or anything else as well. Please do. So yeah, okay, I guess with that, I'm happy to. Oh, I'm told that we could have extra time if we need them. Well, I mean, I don't. Okay, today 2 to 3, climate justice, activism. Yeah, I think I'm happy to close. But if you have other questions, go for it. But otherwise, I'm happy to close. So. Okay. Okay. I think we're good. Okay. Thank you all.